this midday here. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, but also thanks in advance for what I hope to be an ongoing conversation that will inevitably follow. So once again, let me direct you to the Twitter handle at the bottom of the intro slide that you should now be seeing. Please reach out directly if you have any questions as you begin to put the lessons from today into practice. So as we start, this learning is a behavior session. It's really critical that we look back at about 40 years of research into how humans think. My goal is to try to not create a bunch of behavioral psychologists over the next 45 or 50 minutes, but just provide enough perspective about the fundamental research and allow us to determine unique ways that it could be applied in the educational interventions that we build out. So it is believed that there are two systems that govern the way we think, our reactions, the decisions that we make. One is referred to as a fast system, and it's directed by intuition and emotion and pattern recognition. And the second is referred to as a slow system that's directed by thoughtful, mindful reflection. Now, after 40 years of exploring these systems, we now know that the balance of the systems is rarely ever in check. As a result, everyone on this call, in our personal and our professional lives, struggle to be reflective, to be mindful, and to be rational. And instead, we need help making decisions, making rational decisions, and making behavioral choices that are in our best interest. For example, if we know that walking a few flights of stairs each day is better for our health, why do so few of us use them? Instead, what if using the stairs was made fun? So here, the electronic keyboard on the staircase changes the experience, changes the decision that these individual pedestrians are making. And this research has actually determined that this type of experiential design can drive up to 10 times as many people to choose the stairs. As another example, if the early bird gets the worm, so to speak, why do so many of us struggle with snoozing alarm clocks? Instead, what if the alarm clock, the snoozing took effort? So here's an example of an alarm clock that's designed to not turn off or snooze until you do 25 curls. This makes sleeping through the alarm nearly impossible. Or another example, what if snoozing an alarm clock had an immediate consequence? Here's an alarm clock that will begin shredding your money if you don't act. Again, making sleeping through the alarm nearly impossible. Now, we each struggle with doing what's right, even when we know what the right thing is to do. For example, it may be our weight, it may be healthy eating, it may be work-life balance, or binge shopping, or something as unacceptable and yet still relatively commonplace as wrong-sided surgeries, in which 77% of the time the wrong-sided surgery is performed, it's directly attributable to the surgeon, to the physician, his or herself. It turns out that being human simply means that we are more irrational, we are more biased, and we are less in touch with the rational decisions that we need to make than we generally acknowledge. And our own professional work is certainly not immune to this reality. If lifelong learning is so important to healthcare, why is it that we keep creating interventions that rarely or minimally work? Instead, what if we designed learning specifically for how learners learn? We need to build structure into our intervention, structure that engages our learners in thinking slow, engaging them to be reflective, to be mindful, and to behave like optimal learners. In short, if you're not intentionally designing to make learners more effective, then you're unintentionally designing to undermine them. As we move through the meat of the session, just a reminder, as Corinne shared, you can use the question pane in the GoToWebinars control module, and my Twitter handle, I'll repeat this slide 2 or 3 more times. But as we start to dig into the meat of this, don't forget that your questions can drive a lot of the direction that we go. So to understand what designing for how learners learn looks like, we need to explore 3 building blocks. So we'll talk briefly about learning science, we'll talk briefly about the learning actions, and then we'll talk briefly about the behavioral science. And in walking the walk and talking the talk, my suggestion to you right now is to write these 3 things down or take note of these 3 things. And this is how we'll structure the outline of our conversation that follows. So maybe put learning science in the top of 1 column, learning actions in another column, and behavioral science in the third, and then we'll explore these 3 topics together. Part 1 is a brief review of the learning science, which is critical because though changes have certainly occurred in the way education is being provided, and certainly classrooms and technology have changed over the last few decades, and we can now fit more and more folks into a room with a brighter and brighter projector on a larger and larger screen, and we can shove more and more concurrent tracks and repeating concepts into our agendas. And even though we've adopted a variety of cool, shiny new objects in educational technology, little to none of the change that we've just reviewed was designed around the science of learning. And without the science, we'll never really evolve. So let's see if we can level set and touch on the most critical parts of the learning science. Since the 1960s, it's been understood that between the sensory inputs and long-term memory sits a very limited working memory system. A working memory that is temporary, and it's constrained in the amount of information it can process. And this limitation creates a critical bottleneck in learning. When too much information is presented in too short a period of time, when the cognitive task exceeds the learner's working memory capacity, performance and learning is impaired. Remember that working memory itself is dependent on the construction of schemata. Learners have to connect new information to prior experience. They have to elaborate on pre-existing knowledge. In essence, working memory is dependent on slow thinking. The limitation in working memory is why the fire hose approach to teaching will always fail us. The good news is the cognitivist research that's helped us to understand the memory systems over the last 40 or 50 years has also provided for us a few of the critical levers that we can pull that enable learning and enable learners to overcome the bottleneck. First, we know that learners must be interested, attentive, and motivated to learn. This is the germane load of the learning experience. Next, we know that content has to be relevant such that the learners can make the necessary connections to pre-existing knowledge. If the content's too simple, they'll disengage out of boredom. If the content's too complex, they'll disengage because they're overwhelmed and fearful. Finally, we know that any efforts or distractions that are not directly related to schematic construction creates extraneous load on the learner. Now, as a planner of the educational interventions, it's critical to remember that germane load and intrinsic load, that's motivation and the content matter itself, are rarely in our control. But 99 times out of 100, we control the extraneous load. We control the environment, we control the experience, And this is why we must design for how learners learn. So pausing as we move from part 1 to part 2. As an educational planner, the learning science dictates that we do everything in our power to mitigate extraneous load. As questions start to bubble to the surface, feel free to use the questions pane and we'll address them as time permits. In part 2 of this session, we'll focus on new research which has uncovered a critical missing link in contemporary instructional design, a link that directly addresses a form of extraneous load that was never before appreciated, and one that's closely linked to the human limitations of slow and fast thinking, of rationality, of bad decision-making, and bad behavioral choices. So these dots started to connect for me about 6 years ago, and I went looking for evidence that learners actually knew how to learn. And there is none. The reality is startling, it certainly was for me, just like our broader personal struggles with weight and healthy eating and work-life balance, there's very little evidence that we are better at learning than we are at any of these other complex behaviors. So to dig more deeply, I began to interview clinician learners, eventually interviewing well more than 300, with really 3 goals. The first goal of the interviews was to deconstruct the process of learning. The second goal was to explore how and when learners take different actions in the process of learning, different behavioral choices. And third is to assess how effective or efficient learners were at their individual processes of learning. And in 2012, we uncovered that there are 4 critical actions that drive effective learning. And any educational interventions that fail to support these 4 natural learning actions is at risk of remaining minimally effective. In other words, learners need the same kind of behavioral supports within the learning experiences as we need on staircases and alarm clocks. So let's look at each of the 4 learning actions or learning behaviors. From our research, we identified that learners rely on a jerry-rigged system of notebooks and index cards, post-it notes, or spare paper and pads. So we, as the governors of extraneous load, must consider how we design learning experiences that drive better, more effective note-taking. Number 2, learners rely on a frustrating framework of reminders that includes their calendars, to-do lists, dog-earing the pages of their notebook, or emailing themselves or texting themselves. So we, as the governors of extraneous load, must consider how we design learning experience that drive better reminder setting. Number 3, learners acknowledge that as new questions arise in the learning process, that quite often their attention becomes fragmented and they struggle to search for answers. So we, as the governors of extraneous load, must consider how we design learning experiences that facilitate more effective searching. And finally, learners rely on faculty or other learners to nudge their attention, their awareness, and the necessary learning actions. So we, as the governors of extraneous load, must consider how we design learning experiences that drive or initiate slow thinking, that facilitate the appropriate learning actions at the appropriate times. Now, not only did we identify the 4 critical learning actions, but we also demonstrated that much like the other behavioral and decision challenges we face, learners also struggle with these actions. When asked to grade themselves in their ability to take each action that supports their learning, the results were alarming. Just like we struggle with weight, just like we struggle with healthy eating, just like we struggle with so many complex decisions and complex behaviors in our lives, learners struggle to learn. But now that we know the learning actions exist, we can create the types of support systems similar to the staircase or similar to the alarm clocks. We can create the architecture that fixes the problem. So in 2012, I introduced the Learning Actions Model as an instructional design framework that supports the learning actions. On the left-hand side of the Learning Actions Model are the discrete, critical, natural actions that learners depend on, but that learners are not very good at. On the right side of the schematic is the educator's actions, the obligations that the planner of education needs to commit to so that they can develop the right tools and drive the right behaviors at the exact right time. Now, with the benefit of the Learning Actions Model, it turns out, now having done this for 5 years, that the actions that learners take actually become a novel data point. By looking at when and what the notes and reminders and searches and interactions with the content are at the right times, we begin to understand what the learners found of interest, what they were engaged by, what they were turned off by, maybe what confused them. If you acknowledge that the extraneous load of bad note-taking, bad reminder setting, inefficient searching, and a lack of available nudges creates an overwhelmed learning experience, and an overwhelmed learning experience that is limited by schematic construction and the bottleneck of working memory, then we as the educators must take heed, engaging with the Learning Actions Model and creating those types of behavioral supports that learners need to be effective learners. And so I'll pause one final time just to remind you that you can submit questions. Looks like we may have a couple coming in. And as we navigate through the questions, we'll dive back into the questions. We'll begin to answer them briefly. So finally, knowing the extraneous load undermines learning, overwhelms working memory, the learning actions are necessary but unevolved. Well, this puts the onus on our shoulders. All of a sudden, we now have to not only be instructional designers, we need to be behavioral designers. We need to architect experiences that facilitate the proper learning decisions and that drive slow thinking. Now, thankfully, there's more than a decade of brilliant research that's already laid out this roadmap for us, beginning with B.J. Fogg's behavioral model out of Stanford. And what B.J. points out in his research in persuasive design over the last 10 to 15 years, really, is that behavioral change is actually a product of motivation, a learner's ability, and a discrete set of triggers or external events that uniquely enable the right behavior at the right time. So BJ's formula, behavior change equals motivation times ability times triggers, helps us understand why behaviors do or do not occur. And he's even evolved his model to more clearly illustrate the relationship between motivation, ability, and triggers. And while much of the model may seem logical, there are a few critical points to consider, and I'll try to highlight those. Fogg's model suggests that within the umbrella of motivation as a driver of behavior change, Extrinsic motivation, or carrots and sticks, will rarely ever work for complex behaviors. Instead, it really is almost exclusively the driver, the driver of behavior change is intrinsic motivation, whether it's physiologic need or it's safety, or maybe more pointedly in learning experiences, it's autonomy and esteem and self-actualization. The learner's intrinsic motivation is not that easy for an educator to manipulate. It's why germane load is rarely in our control. When it comes to ability in Fogg's equation, he explains that there's a few critical challenges that often undermine behavior change, and these include the amount of time it takes to take some action, make some decision, or commit to a behavior change, the amount of physical effort that it takes to make some change, the complexity of the change. Non-routine refers to whether it's a change that the learner or the individual is familiar with. Is this a new change to do something they've never done before? Is it a new change to stop something they've never done before? Or are you simply trying to get them to do something familiar a little bit more or a little bit less often? Each of those examples of a behavior change is going to require a slightly different design. And finally, he proposes the idea of deviance. And this suggests that if what you're trying to get a learner or try to get an individual to do is not something that they consider a social norm, it's not something they've seen before, it's not something they're familiar with, but it also doesn't strike them as a behavior that they should be partaking in, then they're going to be less likely to change. And what's really important about this behavioral model, and as it begins to apply to the learning actions model, is that Dr. Fogg suggests that if any of these 5 critical ability elements is scarce, then the behavior won't change. So you could have all the time, it could be easy, the physical effort is reduced, it's very simple, but you don't see it as something other people do, it's not something you're familiar with, then your ability remains low. The ability to change a behavior or take an action is an element of the scarcest resource that an individual has. Now, while motivation and ability may seem logical, probably concepts that you've confronted before, I've always seen triggers, the third element of his equation, as being the most fascinating part of BJ's research. In his model, triggers are external events that momentarily modify motivation or they modify one's ability. For example, he presents 3 types of triggers. The first is a spark. A spark is a form of a trigger that heightens one's motivation momentarily. So if your motivation's low, but you're presented with a spark, that may give you enough momentum to make a change. The second type of trigger is a facilitator. And a facilitator heightens ability. So facilitator can momentarily make some behavior easier to do. And if you're appropriately motivated and now you have the ability, then that behavior becomes something that's attainable. And his third trigger is what he refers to as a signal. And a signal is simply a call out or a highlight at the right time to drive a behavior. So it may just not be something you're thinking about, and therefore you don't take the behavior or make the decision. And if you listen closely to what I just said, it may be something that you're not thinking about, so you don't make the behavior or make the decision. Then what a signal really does is it modifies the slow thinking, fast thinking paradigm. So it moves you into a slow thinking, mindful, reflective scenario, even though that's not the way you were operating before you confronted the signal. And so these triggers are everywhere. And we're going to spend the remainder of this session looking at different forms of triggers. Now, triggers is Fogg's work. So I want to transition here to a concept known as a nudge. And in essence, simplifying this, a nudge and a trigger, any of the forms of triggers, a nudge and a trigger are the same thing. The nudge was proposed in a book, a New York Times bestseller by Thaler and Sunstein called Nudge. A nudge is any aspect of a choice architecture or an environment that alters people's behaviors in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their incentive. So a nudge puts you into a mindful state or puts you into an environment or an experience where you make a decision, you make a behavior change that you wouldn't have normally. And so you can begin to see how the science of nudges, which is now a behavioral economics term, and the science in B.J. Fogg's model of triggers, motivation, and ability are fairly parallel. You may also begin to understand back to germane, intrinsic, and extraneous load, because these very different fields of science are actually coming together in a way that's going to make the education we build far more powerful. It's going to catalyze the educational experiences. And I say that because I firmly believe that if the old adage that a picture's worth 1,000 words is true, then I will commit to you that a nudge is worth 1,000,000 words. We can do so much if we can architect the choices, we can architect the learning experiences. So for example, you may have realized that the staircase and the alarm clock examples we shared earlier are nudges, but there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples. Examples that are all around you. Examples that are impacting your life and the decisions you make probably on an hourly basis. And it's for this reason that in 20 years of scientific research, I've never found anything that stokes my curiosity more than BJ's work and the work of Thaler and Sunstein. Now, you may be familiar with the staircase or the alarm clocks. Maybe some of the gentlemen are familiar with the fly sticker at the back of a urinal trying to help us be more hygienic. And maybe you've heard some stories about the Drunk Tank Pink prison program in the Midwest. These are all intentionally designed. As I said earlier, if you're not intentionally designing to make the learners more effective, then you are unintentionally designing to undermine learning. And so let's look at a variety of small changes that we can make or other areas of research that can affect the interventions we're building. For example, you may be familiar with default checkboxes, right? What a default checkbox does is it defaults an individual to a choice that someone has predetermined to be the desirous choice. Surely you can uncheck the box so you still have your choice, but 9 times out of 10, an individual or a learner will do what is set as the default. And perhaps you've noticed pricing quotes on websites and in stores even come in threes. There's a premium, a plus, and a basic option. Well, what research suggests is what that's doing is nudging you to the middle choice. I don't need to pay for premium, and I deserve better than basic. It turns out from the research into choice making that the middle choice is 20 times more likely to be selected. So think about that when you're creating case studies or scenarios. Think about how you can help frame a choice to make it simpler, or conversely, how you can help frame a choice to make it a little bit more sophisticated for the learners to navigate. As I said, there's hundreds of examples, well-established nudges that impact our everyday life. For example, the pink that was shown in the jail cell early on, that pink has been used in college athletic locker rooms for the away team. That pink has been demonstrated to drive calmness and reflection. Well, aren't they two principles of slow thinking? Aren't they two principles of creativity? Isn't that what we want our learners to be doing as they're consuming content? We want them to be reflective. We want them to be calm. We want them to be slow thinking. Likewise, font disfluency. Which of the words on this slide do you think learners will remember the most? It's cute in typography. It seems like a cute theory, but it's got real evidence-based legs to it. In fact, learners perform 20 to 30% better on tests that leverage font disfluency. Likewise, learners are 2 times faster in completing creative puzzles if the light bulb imagery is presented to them before and during the exercise. 2 times faster in creating puzzles. Isn't that the type of thinking that we want our learners to be engaging in during our interventions? Matching political or nationalistic imagery. It's got to be matched. If you match the political or nationalistic imagery, it can lead to learners working twice as hard on complex or unsolvable puzzles. Don't you want your learners to be more engaged, to be more attentive, to be more focused, to put in more effort into the learning experience? Matching the religious imagery. Again, you have to match it to the right learner, but matching religious imagery drives the time and the depth at which a learner will commit to self-assessment. It increases indices of humility, and it drives greater teamwork, coordination, and collaboration. Again, aren't they the skills that we want learners to be committing to while they're engaging in our content? One final example of well-established evidence-based nudges that you've probably experienced and been manipulated by for years is the idea of linguistic framing. And this is such a great case study, right? If you were to ask bystanders on the side of the road who had just experienced an accident how fast the cars were going when they contacted each other, or how fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other, or how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, the answers the learners are giving you are going to be significantly variable. By simply changing the word from contacted to bumped to smashed, you've changed the memories that those bystanders have of the accident. You've changed their perspective. It's that easy sometimes to manipulate fast thinking. That's why slow thinking becomes so critical. So I think in the last few minutes we have before we get to questions, it may help us if we take a shot at beginning to apply some of the slow thinking behavior change science, nudge science to the learning actions. Right? If you remember early on, we posed the question, if lifelong learning is so important, why is it that we create these interventions that rarely work? By now, the idea of designing learning for how learners learn should seem urgent to you, hopefully. Understanding that the different forms of nudges or triggers, the architecture and the environment that you design is going to determine whether extraneous load is high and the working memory bottleneck is limiting, or whether extraneous load is low, and the learners can effectively and efficiently consume your content. And so I'll give you a couple examples. One is universal, and it blows my mind every time I hear someone say, we're not giving handouts out because we're going to go green. That handout is your obligation to a learner to not only set an expectation that they should take notes, because they'll forget to if you don't remind them, but it also gives them a structure in which those notes are directly connected to the content. If you don't do anything else from what I've talked about today, please make 3UP slides available to every learner in every meeting or every learning intervention you design. And just like Corinne did before this call, tap them on the shoulder a few times and say, why don't you download the handouts? It'll really help you take effective notes, and it'll help you follow along. Let's not assume that the learner knows that that's their responsibility. It seems counterintuitive, but the research is clear that learners don't know how to learn, just like they don't know how to maintain their weight, they don't know how to maintain healthy eating habits, they don't remember to take the stairs. Learning is a behavior. So 5 years ago, when I co-founded Archimedix as the Chief Learning Officer, we built software intentionally designed to support what the learning actions research had uncovered for us. So there's other ways to do this. This is not a commercial for Archimedix, but I'm just going to point out some of the simple design choices we made that serve as triggers or nudges to drive the right behavior at the right time. For example, in the upper right-hand corner, the learner will always know where they are. As your attention ebbs and flows, as you start thinking more and more about complex concepts, you may lose track of where you are in the intervention. And when you lose track of it, you don't know how much is left. And when you don't know how much is left, it overwhelms you, and you don't think you have enough time, because BJ said time's important. So we want to make sure that they always have an eye on the clock. Number two is we're going to present them with an omnipresent nudge, both in the figurative and the literal sense, that directs them to take notes within the application so that their notes are directly connected to the content, not unlike 3UP slides. Then we're going to allow the educator to create focused, attentive nudges in what we refer to as the learning stream to highlight and supplement the most important parts of the educational content. Maybe at 8 minutes, the faculty member says, this is the most important research in this field. Well, right at that moment, present them with the research. Don't make them go look it up. Don't just give them a reference in the bottom right-hand corner of a slide, thinking they're going to go to the library or they're going to do the PubMed search and they're going to download the article. Give them the resource at the right moment. Mitigate the extraneous load. Likewise, we're going to allow them to set reminders that the application will schedule and will send out in the days and weeks and even months that follow. So they don't have to dog-ear the pages of their notebook. They don't have to rely on Post-it notes. They don't have to fail to reflect and revisit the learning experiences. Bring this all together for them. And this is our approach. We've been doing this for several years. This is the breathing life into the learning actions model. But in the years that we've been doing it, we've validated it. And so we now, in head-to-head comparative trials of traditional e-learning versus e-learning that is designed in keeping with the learning actions model, we know that learners that experience this behavioral support, that are driven to slow thinking, that are engaged and taking the right actions at the right time, are 4 to 6 times more effective than learners that are left to their own devices. 4 to 6 times more effective, and all we've done is created the nudges in a variety of different forms that create a learning experience, that creates a support safety net that drives the learners to take the right action at the right time. So as I finish, I'm going to see if I can do the same thing for you guys. So right now, no matter where you are, piece of pen and a paper, and I just want you to write, hopefully a Post-it note, just write the term learning is a behavior. Just write it down on a Post-it note or a piece of paper with a piece of tape. And we're going to put ourselves in situations where for the next few days or the next few weeks, we're going to constantly trigger or nudge ourselves to reflect on the fact that learning is a behavior. And so I'm going to ask you to put this Post-it note on your bathroom mirror. I'm going to ask you to put this Post-it note on your refrigerator door. And I'm going to ask you to put this Post-it note on your computer monitor or on your keyboard, someplace that you are constantly thinking about learning, you're thinking about weight loss, you're thinking about healthy eating habits, and you understand how challenging those things are. And now, going to try to help us connect this lifelong experience of behavioral complexity to the very real experience of learning complexity. And so with that, see if we can bring up the question panel. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Is that correct, Corinne and Andy? We're on time, I believe.
Yeah, we have time for questions. So if you want to...
Sure, I've got the question pane open.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'll just go in order that the questions were submitted. So how do we get leadership to value these principles? Corinne, Andy, this webinar is going to be recorded, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
All right, so I highly recommend either reaching out directly to me, or if you are so moved to, when you get the links to the recorded webinar, share it with your colleagues. Try to get 2 or 3 people in your organization thinking alike. It's not overwhelming to apply the learning actions model and to think of learning as a behavior. In fact, it's just the opposite. It is inspiring and it is catalyzing. And so you just need to find a couple examples in your own programs, in your own interventions, and I can help you design them. I mean, this is just fun for me. This is really fun, right? So let's see if we can find some opportunities. And obviously, if you'd like to partner, between organizations, all the better. But if it's 3-up slides, if it's Post-it notes, if it's just getting the faculty to stop momentarily and say, don't forget, you can do this, this, and this. However we can build that safety net, find an example. So the second question then is, how do we train the faculty to ensure that they follow the educator actions? This is a question I get quite frequently, and my experience with it has been faculty want, more often than not, they want to be effective. They don't want to waste their time. They may have a hero complex and they simply want to be seen as great. They may want to be seen as the most knowledgeable person in the room. They may want to be seen as the best teacher. That's their intrinsic motivation, for good or bad. Absent of the learning actions model, it is highly unlikely that the educational intervention and the effort that the faculty members put into creating the educational content is going to be received. We can all point to examples where learners learn something. My point is not that they can't learn something. My point is that they rarely learn efficiently and effectively. We're not optimizing the learning experiences. So I simply tell the faculty members that moment where you wrap your knuckle on the desk and say, this is the most important research, what is it that you want the learners to do right then? Like, what do you hope that emphasis drives in your learners? And they're like, oh, that they should realize that that's the most important point. I said, but what do you want them to do? Simply getting them to realize that it's important is not learning. They have to take action in those moments. So consider the learning actions model to be post-production, or CGI, if you will, and the faculty members can speak and they can lecture and they can do whatever they're comfortable with. But other places in the environment, you may be able to apply the learning actions model around the faculty, but you're going to have much more success when you find those faculty who realize that you are providing guidance to them that's going to make them look even better. Does teaching learners how they learn help them learn better? Yeah, unquestionably, Derek. I mean, both from anecdotal experience, almost everyone I interviewed in the learning actions research took about 5 or 10 minutes into the interview before their eyes opened, and they almost all had that eureka moment, like, wait, right, the things that I do when I'm trying to consume content are pretty crappy, and I get frustrated by them. But if I look back to when I was a sophomore in high school, I really haven't changed how I do them. I've been doing the same thing, getting by, and yeah, I'm smarter than the average bear, so maybe I made it to med school or so. You know, they can create scenarios where they demonstrate they've had some success, but I've yet to meet a learner who, upon slow thinking reflection, can point to all the steps they've made to optimize their lifelong learning process. That's what we're trying to do as an educator. So the next question is, if I didn't think that learning was a behavior before today, what did I think it was? And that's a really interesting question. So I would believe that the vast majority, maybe 95 to 100% of educators, believe that there is a connection between learning and behavior, but it's one directional. That people learn something so they can behave differently. Our outcomes models talk about performance as an outcome of education. It talks about competence, skills, outcomes, patient outcome. Like, behavior is always the end of the learning process. And what the learning actions research suggests, and really suggests for the first time, is that behavior, certain types of behaviors like note-taking, reminder setting, searching, and interacting with nudges, and that behavioral science is as critical to the process of learning as learning is to the broadly recognized behavior changes that we all try to induce in our learners. So I don't know if you thought it was something different. What experiences has taught me is most people didn't think about putting the L or putting the behavior before the learning. They always see it the other way. And then the final comment is, I guess we need to be nudge meisters, and I couldn't agree more. If you go to the Archimedix blog, you'll find dozens of posts and resources that I've shared over the last 5 years, including a primer on nudge theory and nudge science, including Rich and Cass's book, books by many others, Blink, Dan Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, obviously, Sway, Drive by Dan Pink, Dan Ariely's work on irrationality, all of that behavioral science. Now that we understand that behavior change undermines learning itself, we can no longer just be instructional designers and think that we're going to have the impact that we're going to have. And ultimately, putting money where my mouth is, I would take on any instructional designer in the world who focuses on adult learning theory, and I'll focus on adult learning theory and behavioral science, and we'll see who moves the needle more. It's not a fair fight. Adult learning theory is quaint and it's necessary, but it is totally insufficient to drive the type of outcomes we want to drive. So that's, Corinne, Andy, that's all the questions we have. I'm more than happy to, as I said, my Twitter handle is right there. Hopefully, oh, did we get one that came in? Another question just came in?
Yeah, it's actually a co-question. So Jamie had asked, how did you come to choose and define the 4 natural learning actions? Are they based on specific research, or did you translate what you know about learning to these 4 concepts?
No, these 4 actions were what was uncovered in those 300 semi-structured interviews with clinician learners. So So Jamie, you're participating in a webinar and Dr. McGowan mentions the 4 learning actions and you think that's of interest to you. It validates your schema. It invalidates your schema. You have that moment of cognitive dissonance. Jamie, in that moment, what do you do? Like, what action do you do at that moment that supports your process of learning? And through this research, 85+% of the learners that I interviewed said that the first thing that they do when they have that cognitive dissonance is they take a note. And then I would dig in. So how do you take it? You're at a webinar, you're sitting in a live classroom, you're sitting in a hotel conference room. How do you take the note? And so I would get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of different scenarios and how notes were taken. And then I'd say, okay, so after that note, what happens then? What do you do with that note? Well, if it's important, I'll dog-ear the pages of my notebook, or I'll slide it into my checkbook in my purse, or I'll send myself an email. I want to remind myself to take some action or revisit some concept later. Well, tell me more about the reminder system. Well, I use 3 different markers and 4 different highlighters, and I write really hard on the piece of paper, and I try to like almost ingrain important notes into my notebook so I can see it, the different depths. And the learners going through this process unveiled these actions, and probably by the 25th or 30th interview, they were crystal clear that every interview I'd done and every interview I will do for the rest of my career, the learners are going to point to these 4 actions. And the nudge one's the interesting one, because what they started to say is, as they're taking notes and as they're setting reminders and as they're searching, their attention's constantly becoming fragmented. And it's that moment where the faculty member knocks on the desk and says, this is important, that all of a sudden they become attentful. Or it's the learner who's sitting next to them who starts taking a note feverishly that cues them back into the fact that they must have missed something. And so the nudge piece came about by all the different experiences that the learners were describing about how their efforts, the process of learning that they've applied, so often fails them. So 300+ interviews at the point where we founded Archimedix, the point where I had so much confidence in the model that we co-founded a software company to solve the problem. And subsequent to that, we've now validated it in tens of thousands of learners across hundreds and hundreds of activities. So, Corinne, was there anything else?
Yeah, we just had one last one from Andy, kind of to go off of the 4 learning actions. So how should we redesign our webinars based on this research?
Yeah. So first things first is we'll start with the lowest hanging fruit, right? Make sure there are 3-up handouts. Whoever invented the 3-up handout for the PowerPoint Microsoft company should go down in the annals as one of the greatest instructional designers of all time. I know it was not done for that intention. It just seemed like a easier way to save some ink and paper, but it really is brilliant. Aside from that, stop, intervene from time to time. At scale, when you get to 50 or 100, or in some of the rooms that we run, 1,000 learners, the learning actions model becomes critical, but the types of devices that you apply are very, very different than if I'm teaching or coaching one-on-one. But I want to make the point that if you're doing a simulation exercise, or you're doing a role-playing exercise, or some skill-building exercise, or some didactic lecture, no matter what the learning format is, the learning actions model is as critical, because the behaviors of learning are as critical. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you guys to close.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. So just a few closing remarks. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this webinar. There is a short survey that will come onto your screen after we end today. So if you would please just take a few moments to complete that for us. We really value your feedback. And then also there will be a follow-up email that we will send to you that'll have a link to the webinar recording, as well as the handout as well. So thank you all for joining us this Tuesday, and enjoy the rest of your days.
And I want to say thank you, Brian, for that really useful and informative presentation. And I'll be definitely checking out some of the reading you've got posted on your blog. So, okay, thanks.
Thank you all.